Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 34th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy occurs at the precipice of the Promised Land in the 40th and final year of their wilderness wanderings. The length of the duration of years was determined by the scouting report as indicated in the book of Numbers, which had been sent to investigate the Promised Land. The scouting party, and all but Joshua, who is Moses' designated successor, and Caleb responded with fear rather than faith, because there was the presence of literal giants there, and this dissuaded them from persuading the nation of Israel to go and claim the promise. So for that grievous sin, they were designated to wander effectively in circles and a geographical range approximately the size of the state of New Jersey for 38 years after that. And much of Deuteronomy, which literally translates as second reading of the law, is Moses establishing the law which had been given to him at Sinai 40 years earlier, and what it was going to mean to them when they settle from a nation of nomads into a nation of agriculturally settled and stationary people. So the opening verse reads, "And Moses went up from the desert plains of Moab to Mount Nebo on the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And Yahweh showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan." Now, Moab was a neighboring nation of ancient Israel. They were descendants of the incestuous liaison between Lot, Abraham's nephew, and one of his daughters. And they coexisted often in acrimony with their neighbors throughout their history. But the nation of Israel, which has yet to establish itself in a stationary nation, is passing through their land at this moment of time. And Jericho is the oldest occupied city in human history. Archaeological excavation proves that it's been inhabited for at least 12,000 years, something no other city can claim. And Dan was, I believe, at the southern extremity of what became the nation of Israel. "And all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim, and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah, as far as the western sea." So because Israel was comprised of 12 tribes, each tribe would be divided their respective portions of the territory they were to claim. So the tribes were each descended from a patriarch who was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, alternately known as Israel, through whom the promise of Isaac through Abraham passed. And so these are references to many of the tribes and their designated locations. "And the Negeb, and the plains of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zar." So palm trees were prominent presence in the desert land of adjacent to Jericho, so much so that it was known as the city of palm trees, and these would have been rare in the desert environment. But the nation of Israel is actually geographically diverse, and this has aided in the spreading of the Bible in the ways that the Quran could never hope to, because the Quran was written largely to a desert people, so they're not going to have languages which translate into the conditions and cultures of the Eskimos, whereas within the parameters of the chosen Promised Land exist every diversity of geographical and natural condition with which can be communicated across every culture in the world. "And Yahweh said to him, This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, To your seed I give it. I have let you look at it with your eyes, but you do not pass over there." So all of the patriarchs of the Jewish people had dwelled in this land that he was about to claim, but the situation prominent regional famine emerged during the lifetime of Jacob, which forced his family to become a nation within the nation of Egypt, where his son, who provoked the jealousy of his brothers, which with his boasting and with his the favoritism which his father displayed towards him, through found himself emerging as in the essential equivalent of the prime minister's capacity there. And then they were enslaved because a pharaoh who came along who knew not Joseph, and this is the most reasonable scholarly hypothesis, is that this would have been a reference to the foundational king of the new kingdom of Egypt. Ancient Egypt is divided into three main historical categories: the old, the middle, and the new kingdom. So the middle kingdom was interrupted by the presence of Hyksos, who were foreign nomadic people from the north who introduced horses and invaded the chariots. And because Egypt had no similar military capabilities, they were easily overrun, but they claimed their land back during the foundation of the 18th dynasty, which would have marked restoration of native nationalism and a xenophobia, which could conceivably compel the pharaoh to suppress a nation of foreigners budding in his land. But the historical echo of this phenomenon reverberates most powerfully rather recently in what was to become the farewell address of Martin Luther King Jr. He likened himself to Moses in that God had permitted him to envision the land which he would not live to experience. And of course, he was shot immediately after that death, giving the statement an aura of prophecy. And even though we have come a long way since then, the work is always before us to live in a more perfect post-racial society. And Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of Yahweh. Now, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, collectively known as the Torah, which in Jewish Hebrew, which translates as law, or the Pentateuch in Greek, which is derived from the number 5, our shape, pentagon, is 5-sided, are attributed to the writings of Moses, but it would have been physically impossible for him to have written at least, if not the entire 34th chapter, certainly beginning at the 5th verse. That would have had to have been someone else. Who it was, it's ultimately mysterious. But and we learn from the book. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, and no one knows his burial place to this day. Now, from the New Testament book of Jude, we read of a confrontation which occurred between the archangel Michael and the adversary, contending over the body of the recently deceased Moses. And in the 9th verse of the book which bears Jude's name, we find an instructive model to follow should we ever ourselves be confronted by Satan himself. He is a qualitatively superior being. So should such a situation arrive, we could never hope to help ourselves on our own power, but we can do what Michael did, who said, Yahweh rebuke thee. So rest on this foundation of a superior power, lest we be overwhelmed by a power who is superior to us. And for reasons unbeknownst and perhaps not entirely relevant, Yahweh elected to keep the location of his most exalted servant in obscurity. So it's an unidentifiable mystery, and no one knew then and no one knows now. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his freshness gone. So this is a pretty long life as far as the post-diluvian is concerned. And the antediluvian, diluvian means flood, so pre-flood, humans enjoyed longer life. Most of the righteous remnant from Adam to Noah enjoyed lives all in the range of several hundred years. But after the flood, he reduces the length of life to Moses lived on certainly the extreme end of its possibility, and his life of 120 years can be conveniently categorized into three chronologically precise and equal length measurements. So the first 40 years of his life he spent raised in Egyptian royalty and was conditioned and cultured by the best that Egypt had to offer. And this then he finds himself for 40 years as a shepherd in the land of Midian. Midian was another neighboring nation descended from Abraham, who was also the father of the Jews. And then the final 40 years, we find him leading the Exodus, his people. Now, the duration of that time was, for reasons earlier mentioned, destined to be walking in essential circles, but he did learn much and teach much in the course thereof. So even though it may seem to be not the most productive or efficient utilization of human resources, the Exodus is rich and replete with lessons for posterity to profitably deduce. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the desert plains of Moab 30 days, and the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were completed. So that sounds like an unusually long period of mourning. 30 days, that's the effective equivalent of an entire month devoted to mourning the passing of a beloved one. And Moses certainly would have been a figure of adoration and affection to the Jewish people, so much so that he is exalted as their preeminent figure. He was the architect of the Jewish nation. He was their lawgiver. He was the standard around which all the prophets revolved. So there is really no one quite like Moses in the course of Jewish history. And Joshua son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him, and the children of Israel listened to him, and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses. So the transfer of authority by the laying on of hands is an operation which we witness. Paul writes of it in one of the Timothys. So it's a New Testament practice, but it does have Old Testament roots, and from the laying on hands came the spirit of wisdom, which would enable him to govern nascent nation yet to be established, who had been spending 40 years in the wilderness, unaccustomed to the comforts of civilized society, or at least the fullness thereof. Nomads existed in what might be deemed a semi-civilized state, but not fully civilized. And but Joshua was a worthy and effective successor, and he was general. He was a military leader, whereas Moses was a lawgiver, and but their respective roles each served their complementary function. It became necessary for general to lead the nation of Israel now that their wandering phase had completed and they were about to settle in a land. In order to settle, they first had to conquer it. So Joshua's abilities and services would have been more necessary than Moses's in that particular situation. So Yahweh did in fact know what he was doing when he designated the 40-year period and prohibited his most faithful servant from entering the land on a single account of disobedience. And since then, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face. So face to face, he spoke to him. It is elsewhere written mouth to mouth. So he had an intimate access, and then I believe in the 12th chapter of Numbers, we read of a dialogue between Moses and his siblings, Miriam and Aaron, and Yahweh intervenes and informs them, frankly, that the customary means through which he communicates the revelation of himself through most prophets is in dreams and visions, but with Moses, he has the more exalted and intimate access. So Moses was the prophet around whom every other prophet revolved. The formula of the prophets is completely consistent with the framework of the covenant and law of Moses. So the office of prophecy emerged as necessary because the people left to their own devices were by nature covenant violators. So, but they all had their model and standard in Moses. For all the signs and wonders which Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, and before all his servants, in all the land. Now, one of the measures of the extent to which one can claim to be divinely empowered is the miracles which are wielded through their hands. So by measure of the message and the miracles, Moses was, shall we say, unique, because when we examine the respective claims for the mightiest prophets, Elijah did not write prolifically, did not leave posterity any writings bearing his name, but he was the most effective prophet as measured by the administrations of miracles, whereas perhaps Isaiah may be the most prolific of the literary prophets, but Moses trumps them both and trumps them all by measure of message and miracles. And for all that strong hand and all the great fearsome deeds which Moses did before the eyes of Israel. So this is the conclusion of a life well spent, even though he was not permitted to view or live to experience the promised land. He was permitted to see it, and through faith he actually was elevated to heaven upon death. So he was in fact in a more blessed abode than an earthly promised land, and that is the promised land of which we all await. Our citizenship is in heaven. Though we may not live in this lifetime to witness it, we can be assured of it at death. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.